The title of my sermon tonight is called Offspring, Not Orphans. I have more than a strong connection to Geelong. I've actually returned here to live. And in a leafy suburb not far from where I live, the landscape is dominated by a very large building, which is now a school and a housing estate. When I was a kid, we all knew it was a place where the unfortunate children lived. It was called St. Augustine's Orphanage. It closed long ago with many of its secrets. Some terrible things happened there within its walls, like in many orphanages. At one time, Australia had 800 orphanages, and some of them housed hundreds of children. Children whose parents had died or whose parents couldn't look after them. And UNICEF estimates that there are more than 153 million orphans worldwide. They, in their own way, must wonder what will happen to them, who will look after them, who will stand alongside them. I worked with some women a number of years ago, and Sylvia will know some of these women of which I speak, who had lived in such places and were traumatised by that experience. Even though they left those institutions at about 15 years old and were now in their 80s, they were all still scarred by what had happened. I have heard stories of them having to clean floors with toothbrushes, being punished for wetting the bed as children, being smacked or belted, and feeling so alone. Some were in there because their parents had died. Indeed, my mother's cousins were in one of these orphanages because their parents had separated and they needed to live somewhere until their mother could get back on her feet. Sometimes siblings were separated. I remember one woman crying with me as I gave her a Christmas hamper one year, and she explained, because she grew up in an orphanage, she had never received her own Christmas present. And for another woman, it was her safe place. There was and is an enormous stigma associated with being in an orphanage, being an orphan. There's a group who help people who have left these places decades ago called the Forgotten Australians. And they remind us of the trauma that is triggered in their old age. The sound of keys clinking together reminds them of being locked in rooms. The smell of disinfectant reminds them of cleaning on their hands and knees. And of course, these are the things they now experience in hospitals and aged care facilities. So they are re-traumatised. I guess one of the most famous orphans we think of is Oliver Twist. Oliver, orphaned as an infant, raised in a workhouse, which was really just child labour. The children received little food and they would draw lots to ask for extra food or gruel. One day it was Oliver's turn, and we all remember those famous words, "More please." A ride ensures and Oliver is sent away. He then gets into a fight and escapes to London. There he falls in with a group of thieves and is trained by Fagin as a pickpocket. Not unusual in Victorian England. I became an orphan in 2018 when my dad died. However, many years earlier, I was rudely confronted with the idea. My mother had just died and I was at a BUV meeting and some older women had just found out. One of them, who I knew quite well, and some of you will also know her, so she won't be named, simply announced, "Well, now you are an orphan." I was horrified. I was hurt. My grief returned. I was reminded of my vulnerability. I was hurt not just because of her lack of empathy, but because of the stigma associated with being an orphan. Another reason for my indignation was that I wasn't actually an orphan, as my dad was still alive and relatively well at that time. Well, considering he had simply lost his wife of the last 50 years. I guess I was confronted with a sense of abandonment, of being alone and lonely, of my mortality. Not long after that event, I'd been at a long and frustrating BUV Executive Council meeting. And when I got home, I was actually deciding if I would resign from the council or not. And the phone rang. I thought it was going to be another council member checking in to see how I was. No, it was Uncle Teo. Now, Uncle Teo was calling from Nagaland in northeast India, and I had hosted him about 7 years previously when he'd attended a Baptist conference in Melbourne. He was an important man in Nagaland, a politician. And when he was here, I'd introduced him to my family and to the beach because Nagaland is landlocked, so the beach was not something they went to. He'd just found out from somebody else that my mother had died. He was calling to offer his condolences, to tell me that he missed her. And then he said he just wanted me to know that I wasn't alone. He and his family were with me. What a contrast to the other woman's words. Not an orphan, but one who was loved by others across the miles. Little orphan Biddy, a name my mum called me, was not orphaned. God had placed people in my life, even on the other side of the world, who reminded me I was not alone. This is a little bit of what I think Jesus is trying to tell his disciples. The Bible is clear on the need to care for the orphans and widows. The psalmist reminds us that God relieves the fatherless and the widow, Psalm 146:9. And in my experience, I can see why. For many, this experience is intensely painful. And as Oliver teaches us, as well as the experience of the forgotten Australians, ripe for exploitation. But I also imagine the pain of the orphan is matched by the one who is doing the leaving. Jesus understands this. He knows his leaving will distress his followers, and might I say, distress him as well. This experience will be akin to being orphaned. In our reading today, he goes to great lengths to remind his followers that they will not be abandoned, alone, unable to connect with each other, even after he has left. He tells them of this, his gift, the gift of the Spirit, the gift of God's abiding presence to comfort, to enlighten, to guide, to instruct, to defend, and to advocate for us forever. We are not alone. Jesus will be absent and yet present. We will be adopted, belong, know security, and be loved as we become part of this worldwide family of God. Paul knew this, that God does not abandon us. He also knew this. Not in the reading we had today, but in the Acts reading of the story about the unknown God. Paul finds himself in Athens, confronted by many religious statues and a memorial stone to the unknown God. He knew his God was different. Paul's God was known, was present, was intimate, was never alone, was living and never alone. We are offspring, he says, not orphans. We are not alone or orphaned. The one who creates, loves, reconciles, shows us the way to truth, shows us to the way into the future, is an abiding presence with us. Like Uncle Teo reminded me, we are not alone. We are loved. As Gustavo Gutierrez observes, it is the abiding presence of the Spirit that enables us to be children of God, God's offspring, and not orphans. However, there is more to this relationship. It is two-way. It is a relationship, and just as we are loved, we are called to love. Keeping God's commands is always about love of God and love of neighbour. It's a community of love. And this kind of love means we cannot allow others to live as orphans, to live in distress and pain, to live ostracised or traumatised, to live lonely lives, to live in such a way that they feel abandoned or without hope. And this must affect the way we welcome asylum seekers who acutely feel a sense of abandonment at Footscray, we have a number of asylum seekers in the congregation, and they have got to a point now where they are able to say, whatever you need us to do, we will do, because this is our family, this is our home. It must affect the way in which we welcome in the homeless. It must affect the way we embrace those battling addictions. It must affect the way we treat those exploited by others or by the system. It must affect the way we try to understand those who have been abused. Together, we are offspring and not orphans. We are not alone. In God, we have life, love, and being, and because of that, we cannot allow others to be crippled by feeling alone. But it's hard. In the great Saint Lunig's words, we are called to love one another. It's as easy and as hard as that. Amen.